sins are forgiven. Alleluia, 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 alleluia. Open our hearts, O Lord, and listen to the words of your Son. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee into the district of the Decapolis. And people brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment and begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him off by himself away from the crowd. He put his finger to the man's ears and, spitting, touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said to him, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened. His speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. He ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished, and they said, He has done all things well. He makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. The Gospel of the Lord. So today is Friday of the 5th week, which means we continue going through this book of Genesis. We've been hearing about the creation of the heavens and earth all week long. We talked about how chapter 1 is like a macro perspective where God creates his earthly temple. And then in the second chapter, we read more specifically about his relationship with Adam and Eve, more of his familial relationship with the world, the family he's established in Adam and Eve. And here in the third chapter of Genesis, we see where the family begins to crumble because of the entrance of the evil one, the ancient serpent. And there are a number of things that we should pay attention to in this chapter 3 of Genesis. Many of us have this idea of this chapter and of the fall of Adam and Eve, and we kind of have some misconceptions which are tailored on different readings of the Old Testament. It's important when you go back and you read these in their original language, there is kind of a different side that many of us are used to. For example, many of us have this impression of Adam and Eve, and we think about the apple that they ate of. Many of us think it was an apple. Genesis doesn't say which fruit it was. But the ancient rabbis, when they were interpreting this, they said it was a fig tree. A fig tree because when Adam and Eve, after they sinned, it says they took fig leaves and made loincloths for themselves. So presumably, the tree that they ate from was a fig tree. That's partly why Jesus curses the fig tree in the New Testament, right? It's like he's cursing the tree that caused the original sin. Another thing we should notice here, and again, this is where reading in Hebrew makes a difference, is the word for serpent. It's the Hebrew word nahash. Elsewhere in the Bible, this word is translated in slightly different ways. For example, in the book of Revelation, in chapter 12, when the great red dragon with 7 horns and 10 heads, right, is prepared to devour the woman's offspring, right, St. John says that this is the ancient serpent, right? The same person here in the book of Genesis. Nahash elsewhere in the Old Testament is used to refer to the great sea beast, the Leviathan, in the prophet Isaiah. So when we think about this serpent, right, we shouldn't just think of like a little harmless snake. The Hebrew language is a very simple language, and words can mean lots of different things. We should be reading this as a very large and intimidating creature. When he's speaking to Adam and Eve, he's not so much being just simply cunning and intelligent, but he's being treacherous and threatening. In fact, the Hebrew word used for the serpent was the most cunning of all the animals, right? It can be used to describe something that is treacherous or threatening. Sometimes we picture this story as well, that Eve was by herself when the devil was speaking to her. But not true. Adam was right there with her, as it says right here in the text today. She took some of the fruit and ate it, and then she gave some of her husband who was with her. And they both ate. When those details come into the picture, right, it kind of gives us a different idea of what is going on here. It's not just simply that Adam and Eve were tricked. It is that they were being threatened. And the one at fault is not so much Eve, because it was Adam's job to protect the garden and to protect his bride. We heard about that in chapter 2. Right? So instead of blaming the woman, we should be asking ourselves, why didn't Adam defend the garden and defend his bride? Some of these things come out when we read these texts carefully. Now, if you don't believe me when I'm talking about the serpent in this way, right, you'll notice in a few verses later in Genesis chapter 3, if you go home and read this, one of the curses against the serpent was God said, from now on your belly you will crawl. Why would God say, from now on your belly you will crawl, right, if he already did, and if he was just merely a snake or a mere serpent? Now, all of this comes into play later on, especially when it comes to the coming of Jesus, right? Because Jesus reverses this fear of Adam. Adam was afraid to do battle with the devil out of fear of death. Christ embraced his death on the cross on the 6th day of the week at the 6th hour of the day. We know that the number 6 has a connection with evil because the mark of the beast is 666. Unlike Adam, who was afraid, Christ, even though he was afraid, embraced the battle of the cross, doing battle with the devil on the 6th day. And by his own death, reversing the consequences of Adam, who brought death into the world out of his own fear. We should also notice that Jesus, when he proclaimed his fidelity to God, right, he did it in a garden, Gethsemane, just as Adam was disobedient in the garden. There are all these different connections that we can see when we notice these minor details in the text. And so it's very interesting as we're going through this. The last thing I'm going to say today is, I know there are some of you here in this church, right? You've heard me talking about this Bible study we're going to be doing during the season of Lent. And some of you I've even asked specifically, right, to consider being a leader. If you haven't said yes to that yet, you might pray about that during the rest of this Mass. We're looking for as many Bible study leaders as we can so that every parishioner can learn how to read these passages in the Old Testament, understand how it connects to Jesus and to our own life. And so if you haven't informed the office or me yet, right, please pray and talk to me after.